Opening a diagonal for the queen and bishop, this gambit immediately contests the center and challenges black's response. A classic riposte, immediately challenging white's central pawn and opening diagonals for the queen and bishop. A solid development, this knight immediately contests the e5 pawn and prepares to castle, aiming for swift king safety and central influence. Developing a knight to its most natural square, this piece immediately contests control of the central squares and prepares for further development. Opening the path for development and staking a claim on the center, this bishop repositions to prepare for castling and influence the d4 square. Challenging the bishop's placement, this pawn advances to gain space and potentially harass the attacker, setting a dynamic tone. Preserving the bishop's diagonal leverage forces black to commit their pawn structure, potentially weakening their kingside. Aggressively challenging the e4 pawn, black initiates a lively central skirmish and opens lines for development. Castling secures the king, preparing to connect rooks and exert pressure on the d-file, a classic Ruy-Lopez maneuver. Developing the bishop quietly prepares for castling, maintaining a solid pawn structure. Initiating central control and preparing to challenge black's knight is the primary objective behind this repositioning, creating a dynamic pawn structure that could soon become a strategic battleground on the e-file. Gaining vital space on the queen side, this pawn push bravely challenges the bishop's established position, forcing a decision and creating potential weaknesses in white's structure if the bishop retreats too far. Retreating the bishop from the aggressive pin allows for a more flexible setup, preserving its influence over the long diagonal without immediate tactical risk, while subtly preparing for potential pawn pushes later on. Solidifying the central pawn structure now offers black a more resilient pawn chain against white's active pieces, creating a solid base from which to develop the queen side and contest control of the d-file. Securing the d4 square and preparing a queenside pawn advance, white solidifies their central presence. This move creates a strong pawn chain and prepares to potentially challenge black's bishop on b7. It's a patient maneuver, building for future positional gains rather than immediate confrontation, aiming for a queenside space advantage. Embracing the flank, black strategically repositions the knight to a5, aiming to dislodge the aggressive bishop and gain valuable queenside space, potentially preparing a pawn push to c5 later on. Shifting the bishop to c2 prepares for central pawn advances, while also defending the c3 pawn and potentially eyeing the queenside. Unleashing a pawn storm to challenge the bishop's outpost and seize central influence, black boldly disrupts white's comfortable setup, aiming to dismantle the queenside pressure and foster a more dynamic middle-game battle by opening lines for their own pieces. Opening the center here, white seeks to shatter black's cramped position and unleash their pieces, aiming for an active central struggle rather than a passive queenside buildup. Unleashing the queen on c7 prepares to challenge the central pawn storm, simultaneously eyeing the light squares and potentially creating escape routes for the king should the center crack open. Pivoting the knight from f3 to d2 opens up a vital diagonal for the queen and prepares to reinforce the e4 pawn, a defensive necessity given black's aggressive pawn thrusts on the queen side. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount. Castling now solidifies the king's position behind a sturdy pawn shield, a sensible defensive maneuver against white's burgeoning central presence. Dampening any immediate kingside pressure, this prophylactic maneuver subtly shores up the king's sanctuary against potential bishop or knight incursions down the g-file, while simultaneously creating a breathing space for the king should the center decide to explode. Reclaiming central space and preparing for the pawn storm on the queen side, this knight repositions itself to a more active square, potentially eyeing the d4 pawn or supporting a queenside expansion. White is seizing the initiative on the queenside by forcefully advancing the d-pawn, aiming to cramp black's position and potentially restrict the activity of the queenside pieces. This pawn push creates a strong central outpost and aims to gain space, forcing black to react to white's territorial expansion. It's a clear statement of intent. White wants to dominate the center and limit black's maneuvering options. This move could lead to a strategic battle for central control, with white hoping to exploit the resulting pawn structures for a long-term advantage, while black must find ways to break free and counter white's spatial dominance. The knight embarks on a surprising journey, a retreat that aims to reinforce the kingside pawn structure and prepare for a potential knight excursion to g6, creating a well-defended outpost. Challenging black's queenside pawn chain is a sound idea, aiming to disrupt black's defensive structure and potentially open lines for attack. Unleashing a pawn storm, black aggressively pushes b4, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and create space for their pieces. This audacious pawn thrust challenges the bishop on b3 and seeks to unravel the position, potentially opening lines for attack or securing a queenside pawn majority. The immediate goal appears to be to cramp white's pieces and gain dynamic counterplay, though it does concede some territory and creates potential weaknesses that white might exploit if they can consolidate effectively. Unleashing a knight to the active c4 square, white immediately pressures black's queenside pawn structure and eyes potential weaknesses around the d6 square, aiming to exploit the space white has gained. Solidifying the pawn chain, black anchors the a5 pawn, preventing white's knight from hopping into the b4 outpost and offering a solid defense against white's queenside expansion. This maneuver, while seemingly passive, prepares for potential counterplay on the kingside and reinforces black's pawn structure, aiming to create a stable defensive barrier. Unleashing a tactical storm, white gambits a piece to shatter black's defensive pawn chain and open lines toward the enemy king. This aggressive strike aims to exploit the king's exposed position following black's recent pawn advances, potentially leading to a swift mating attack or significant material recovery. The sacrifice forces black into a precise calculation, as any misstep could prove disastrous. The long-term implications of this sacrifice hinge on white's ability to coordinate their remaining pieces effectively and exploit the newly created weaknesses in black's camp. Black gracefully redirects the bishop, anticipating white's central pawn push by reinforcing the queenside and creating a more active outpost for the piece on the semi-open file, effectively challenging the threatened central advance and preparing for a potential queenside counterplay. Strategically, this retreat reinforces the bishop's influence on the queenside while simultaneously preparing for potential pawn advances, perhaps c4, to challenge black's central pawn chain and gain more breathing room. A critical decision to embrace immediate tactical fireworks, accepting a temporary pawn deficit to dismantle white's imposing central pawn structure. Black sacrifices material, aiming to shatter the pawn chain and expose white's king, turning what was a positional struggle into a sharp, potentially decisive battle. The game shifts dramatically from maneuvering to raw calculation as black forces white to confront the consequences of his gambit. Seizing the initiative, white strikes decisively into black's weakened pawn chain, aiming to pry open lines and expose the enemy king. A bold gambit is offered as black chooses to accept the pawn, creating a dynamic pawn structure where the central control is significantly altered. This decision invites immediate tactical skirmishes, with the queen potentially becoming a target, but it also aims to disrupt white's coordinated attack by bringing the bishop into active play. Consider how this central pawn exchange will influence the open files and the subsequent maneuvering of minor pieces. A bold sacrifice, liberating the queen to unleash havoc across the board, demanding immediate and precise counterplay from black to survive the onslaught. Accepting the queen trade stabilizes the position for black, unwinding the immediate pressure and preparing for a more even middle game, though it cedes a slight initiative to white. A crucial moment unfolds as the knight captures the queen, initiating a dramatic simplification of the material and opening up new avenues for tactical engagement. Finally, the board clears and a new phase dawns. This knight's repositioning, though seemingly a passive retreat, is actually a cunning maneuver to establish a stronger central presence and potentially harass white's now isolated d6 pawn, while simultaneously preparing to support a future pawn push on the queenside, seeking to create dynamic counterplay against white's potentially exposed king. Eliminating the knight on b7 seizes the opportunity to simplify the position, converting a material advantage into a clear endgame path where your extra pawn will prove decisive. Seizing the open d-file is the immediate, pressing concern as your bishop now occupies a central outpost, threatening to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially infiltrate the queen side. Exchanging that pawn immediately opens the c-file, creating a direct line of attack towards black's queen side. Repurchasing the pawn with the c-pawn opens a diagonal for the remaining bishop and fights for the now open c-file, albeit briefly, while also preventing white from establishing a strong central pawn presence after the recent exchange. Solidifying the central pawn structure is the aim here, aiming to prevent black's knight from potentially rerouting to a more active square and establishing a firm foothold in the center for white's pieces. Re-establishing queenside pressure after the pawn exchange, black repositions the rook to the open d-file, seeking active play and preparing to contest this crucial central artery. Centering the bishop on this central square significantly bolsters white's control over the d6 outpost and prepares for a potential central pawn push or piece redistribution. Seeking to solidify its king's safety, this move simultaneously prepares for a potential pawn push or reinforces the kingside structure. Instigating central activity, Red 1 aims to harness the open d-file, creating a direct line of pressure towards black's now somewhat exposed king. A bold repositioning to solidify the bishop's influence on the kingside and prepare for potential queenside expansion. A bold repositioning of the rook to the semi-open c-file, aiming to intensify pressure on black's queenside pawn structure and potentially contest control of this crucial open corridor. Considering the open, c-file and the bishop pair advantage white holds, black's intention is likely to challenge the initiative by activating their own bishop and preparing for potential counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's central control and open up lines for their pieces. Relocating the king to a safer square allows it to potentially participate in later stages or support pawn advances without immediate threats from black's bishop and rook coordination. Clearing the central file now, black aims to activate the rook and potentially create downstream threats on the queen side as the queens exit the board, simplifying towards an endgame where rook activity will be paramount. Resuming the structural battle on the queen side, the rook's repositioning aims to contest the open file and challenge black's pawn structure. The rook embarks on its final destination, claiming the now open half-open file with intent. Gaining central space often requires a commitment, and pushing the kingside pawn structure like this is an attempt to do just that, potentially aiming to pry open lines for the remaining pieces or to create an escape square for the king. Reclaiming the bishop's influence from its retreat is a calculated attempt to reactivate the piece, aiming to contest the open central files and offer some support to the beleaguered queenside pawns. Unlocking the c-file's potential, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's rook coordination and potentially isolate the d7 bishop by forcing exchanges or creating positional weaknesses. Opening up the kingside with your pawn push is a bold, albeit risky, maneuver, directly challenging white's central grip and offering a path to activate your rook on the queen side, creating immediate counterplay that will demand white's full attention and resourcefulness to neutralize effectively. Sacrificing the bishop on e6 fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating a passed d-pawn for white while simultaneously eliminating black's critical dark-squared bishop, which was instrumental in defending against white's central ambitions and potential kingside threats. This exchange simplifies the position significantly and transitions the game towards an endgame where white's extra pawn and superior piece activity will be decisive, despite the material parity achieved after the subsequent captures. The pawn structure now reflects a complex, unbalanced pawn scar with black's doubled f-pawns creating a weakness that will require careful management, while the open files, especially the d-file, are destined to become critical theaters of operation for the remaining pieces. The king now faces a perilous journey through an open board as white orchestrates a devastating rook invasion, promising to exploit the weakened pawn structure and secure overwhelming material advantage. A forced exchange that liberates the rook from its defensive post, though it leads directly into an endgame where white's king is significantly more active, and black's pawn structure is quite compromised. Suddenly, the board has simplified dramatically, and white has capitalized on the exchange by capturing the bishop, initiating a queenless middle game that immediately favors the side with the more active rook. The knight's retreat to d7 offers a last gasp of positional resistance, seeking to consolidate the weakened kingside pawn structure and prepare for a potential counterplay on the c-file should white become careless with the central pawn majority. Initiating a pawn exchange now, white seeks to simplify into an endgame where the material advantage should be decisive, though careful calculation is still required to avoid any unforeseen tactical traps black might spring. The knight's journey to c5 injects some much-needed activity into black's position, aiming to disrupt white's now slightly awkward pawn structure on the queenside and potentially fork pieces. Anchoring the queenside pawns with b3 shores up weaknesses, preventing further incursions from black's knight, and creating a more solid structure as the endgame looms. Seizing the isolated pawn on b3 creates a dangerous passed pawn, but it pulls the knight into a vulnerable position. Capturing that pawn on b4 solidifies white's material advantage and simplifies the position, pushing black further into a defensive struggle with diminished attacking prospects. Shifting the knight to the center creates an interesting dynamic, challenging the bishop pair and aiming to disrupt white's newly consolidated pawn structure. Pushing this pawn forward initiates a determined effort to seize control of the queenside territory, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn on the flank.